Welcome to Dialogue, a true crime conversation. I'm your host, Rebecca Sebastian. So happy to be back once again. We're starting a new series today, but before I get to that, I want to talk a little bit about some changes to the podcast. Nothing major, but you might have noticed over the last few weeks, I've had dynamically inserted ads. I am with a new podcast platform and they provide those. And it's part of my goal for 2021 to start growing this podcast like I would a business. So ads are part of that. And I know it's a change and I know it can feel a little abrupt and change the rhythm of a show, but I hope you'll just stay with me and bear with me through those, and that, I'll always do my best to place them in the least intrusive ways. But yeah, that's a change that you've probably noticed, and I just wanted to make mention of it here. And also, after the survey that I sent out, which thank you again to everybody who filled that out, I'm making some small editorial changes to the podcast as well, and some you might not even notice, and some you might. Again, I'm just experimenting. It's been about a year and a half since I started the show, and it just felt like time to start making changes, and I'm looking at all of them as progress and evolution and momentum towards, just constantly being better and doing better. So I hope you all will like what you hear, continue to listen, and stay with me because I've got really exciting things coming up in April. I'm going to be rolling out bonus content on Patreon, and I think the bonus content is really good. And I'm also going to be putting out a new initiative, kind of a companion to Dialogue, and that will not be behind a paywall. That's going to be on YouTube. So access for all, free to all. So hang in there, and then the next few weeks, I feel like it's going to be spring and the sun's going to be shining again, and some cool developments will be happening over here on Dialogue. So thank you for being part of this community. I am always here to listen and to hear what you're thinking about things. If you have a suggestion for a guest or a series, or want to let me know what you're thinking about these little changes you're hearing in the show, you can reach out to me on social media. I am at Dialogue Pod across all platforms, and you can drop me a note on my website, RebeccaSebastian.com. There's a contact form there. Okay, that's enough for the business. Let's get to today's episode and the new series. If you're on social media, then you'll know it was International Women's Day yesterday at the time of this recording, but it's Women's History Month, right? And, maybe one day we won't need a month. Maybe we'll just include women in the broader story of our world. But until then, we get a month, and I want to honor the incredible women doing great work in the true crime and society and culture podcast space. So I have 4 weeks of incredible female podcasters lined up, and we are going to talk about notable women of history, women's issues in the criminal justice system, and sometimes just talk about TV shows and things we really like. Of course, this is not exclusive for women. Men are welcome to listen, but it will be exclusively with women and about women. So first up, in honor of Women's History Month, I am speaking with the incredible hosts of a podcast I've come to really love called #History, which you would have heard a trailer for last week on last week's show. Today I'm talking to Leah.
I would say that we've always been true crime nerds. Rachel and I, when we were first talking about possibly starting a podcast, we were leaning towards actually being fully true crime, and then ended up in the history realm just because that's another big passion of both of ours.
And Rachel.
I would like to say that I am a hipster true crime fanatic. I was watching Forensic Files when I was a child, which is really morbid. But, I think this wave of true crime podcasts, it makes us feel like, oh, all these people are coming up out of nowhere that, now everyone's interested in true crime, which I don't think that's necessarily true. I think we all were, and now we're just really delving deep into it.
Rachel and Leah came on, and we decided to talk about Anita Hill. Anita Hill, talk about a notable woman of history. She changed things in this country. She changed a conversation. And I really out myself on how old I am on this show, and I hope I didn't make my guests uncomfortable. We have different lenses from that time period. They know a lot more about the Anita Hill story than I do, and they covered it on a recent episode, which you should absolutely listen to on their podcast. Even though I was the one who was very much alive and conscious and remembers that time period in the early 90s, they actually know the whole story. And we really get into what it meant for our country in terms of sexual harassment and believing women, politics and power. It touches really on everything. And I dare to say Anita Hill is the woman we should still be talking about a lot more. So I'm really excited for you to hear this conversation, and I'm excited for you to check out #History Podcast if you haven't already. Thank you so much, Rachel and Leah, for killing the small talk with me. And boy, do we get fired up. This is a new Rebecca. You guys haven't heard me. I haven't been this fired up in a while. The Survivor series was very intense, a little bit sad. This is like fiery Rebecca. So enjoy today's episode with #History Podcast hosts, Leah and Rachel. Welcome to Dialogue, Rachel and Leah of the #History Podcast. I'm so happy to have you.
Thank you so much. We're so happy to be here.
Oh man, this is going to be really good because I do enjoy history. I just don't feel good at it, and I feel a little rusty, you know? I remember lots of things that I find really interesting, parts of history, like cult history.
Yes.
That's like steel trapped in my brain. But when I think back to some other things, I'm embarrassed that dates are fuzzy. So I love your podcast because it's accessible even for those who maybe aren't history buffs, but are curious about the world's events, right? So maybe you could introduce yourselves and how the show came to be.
Sure. So I appreciate hearing all of that because that is kind of part of our slogan, is that the #History Podcast is for history lovers and for history haters, because we really believe that history is for everyone and that it's okay if, you don't have a fascination with the Industrial Revolution, because who does? So the things we talk about with the #History Podcast are history's greatest stories of controversy, conspiracy, and corruption. So it's the really juicy parts of history, And although we are a history podcast, we do very often dive into true crime topics, which I know is what your listeners come to your podcast for, Rebecca. So for example, some of the more like historical true crime events we've covered are like Jack the Ripper, or we've covered
Lizzie Borden,
or like the Heaven's Gate cult.
Oh yeah. That's a crazy one. I had a survivor of that.
Yes, I've listened to that one.
Yeah, it's wild. He left before the mass suicide, but just a year prior, he finally left. So where do you each fall? Maybe you could each answer this on the true crime spectrum. Is it a recent development for you, or is this kind of a long-standing interest?
I would say that we've always been true crime nerds. Rachel and I, when we were first talking about possibly starting a podcast, we were leaning towards actually being fully true crime, and then ended up in the history realm just because that's another big passion of both of ours.
Kind of a smart move, too, because true crime podcasts, it's getting crowded over here. Yeah. I say the more the merrier, so I'm not discouraging anybody. I'm just saying probably choosing a different niche under the bigger umbrella, like having crimes and conspiracies, is probably really smart. You find your people faster, I would think. Rachel, how about you in terms of true crime?
I would like to say that I am a hipster true crime fanatic. I was watching Forensic Files when I was a child, which is really morbid. But, I think this wave of true crime podcasts, it makes us feel like, all these people are coming up out of nowhere that, now everyone's interested in true crime, which I don't think that's necessarily true. I think we all were, and now we're just really delving deep into it.
Yeah. I mean, historically, some of the things we even cover probably people were fascinated by them at the time. I think the interest in the morbid, the dark, and mortality, that's sort of human nature. You probably see it in the things you cover, I would imagine.
Definitely. Yeah. Especially in things like, our coverage of the Jonestown Massacre, or even we did a really fascinating episode about the Titanic, and that kind of almost dives into true crime-esque realms as well.
How so?
Yeah, there's conspiracy theories behind it that I actually never knew about, but it's so interesting. That it was all plotted. It was all planned.
By who? I've never heard this.
Morgan. JP Morgan.
Way.
Obviously.
Yeah. Who else would it be? Well, that's fascinating on another level because it brings in Sonia Morgan from the Real Housewives of New York. So I feel like all my world's coming together.
Oh my God.
This conspiracy theory, reality TV, history, true crime. Okay, that's really interesting. So do you get into those conspiracies on the episode?
Always. Yeah.
Cool.
We always, if there's a conspiracy, we cover it. We would not be doing our research if we didn't.
I had you both on because it's Women's History Month, which I knew you'd both appreciate and remember. And I thought we could talk about a woman in history whose impact I think is lasting and huge, but maybe undercovered and under talked about. And I loved your recent episode about her. So I was thinking we could talk about Anita Hill, and I just couldn't think of anyone better to do it. So maybe you guys could refresh our audience's minds on who she is. You don't have to say your age, but I was shocked when I was reading about it because it's 28 years ago. And I'm like, and I can remember it, but I was in middle school during the hearings.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
No, yeah.
And
I was born
diapers.
that year.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
And I wasn't born until the following year. I don't mean to make you feel old, Rebecca. She just gave me a look. But what I do find interesting about that is that I do think Anita Hill's testimony is a timestamp in history. And so I think it is neat to be able to say that the huge impact that she had for women across the world and the huge impact that she had for opening up the conversation about sexual harassment in the workplace, that I got to come in the wake of that I got to come after that. And so I think that is a really cool thing too, that I was born in a post Anita Hill world.
Right. No, that's a great point. And it wasn't a look at you. It was just eyes widening because the reality is the reality. So before you tell us all about Anita Hill, I just want to share my memory of middle school. I don't know if it was 7th or 8th grade because we did combined classes for those two grades. I don't know why. So it was social studies and it was current events Friday or something. And our teacher was telling us about the hearings. So we learned about Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill. And I mean, we're 7th and 8th graders. You know, you can imagine how the male population of the class handled, and so she's asking us, what do we remember about it? What did we watch in the news? And there was lots of talk about the soda can and the pubic hair from the males in the class. So when I was refreshing myself on the case and listening to your episode, I'm like, yeah, that was a really big part of the testimony. But I'll never forget what my teacher said to us, which is, with sexual harassment, and I feel like this was kind of revolutionary in 1991, I guess, to be telling a group of on the verge of teenagehood kids, she said, it doesn't matter how the person intends it, it's how the recipient receives it. And that is all you need to know about sexual harassment. And that has never left me. It's like, it doesn't matter if you didn't mean it to be overtly sexual or intimidating or whatever, it's how I'm receiving it, and that's how I'm receiving it. So I feel like it was the beginning of my education in sexual harassment. And so amazing to me.
I love that.
Yeah.
I feel like your teacher was a little ahead of her time too, because I feel like that saying that is very much in our line of thinking nowadays, but in the early 90s, I don't know.
It seems progressive, right?
Yeah.
I think so. And she was an older teacher. So I'm like doubly impressed now looking back. I don't think I thought of that then. I just remember feeling a little bit empowered by that, even at that age. And maybe I'm projecting onto my adolescent self. So remind us. I think most people will go, yeah, Anita Hill, there was a trial or something. But your episode surprised me so much in the details you uncovered that I didn't know or didn't remember. So lay some groundwork for us.
Sure. Yeah. So the quick recap for anyone that either needs a quick refresher or is not familiar with Anita Hill at all is she's best known for that infamous event that thrust her into the spotlight when she testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee in 1991 about accusations that U.S. Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas, while in her capacity as her boss at both the United States Department of Education and at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, had been sexually harassing her. And then we'll dive in to all of it deeper later, her testimony and all of that. But when I'm just giving a snapshot of her, it's so important to understand how much she and her testimony truly changed history. Before her testimony, the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, they received approximately 7,000 sexual harassment cases per year. Following her testimony in the next few years, this number would nearly triple. But why this case is so interesting is because although we see now, in 2020 hindsight, how much her testimony changed history and the way that it empowered other women to speak their truth. That we've already kind of implied this. That was not her reality in 1991. In fact, very few people believed her at the time of her testimony. Her character was completely torn apart. She was doubted and she was called a liar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's unfortunately so synonymous with the way rape victims were treated and sometimes still are, where they're not believed and they're put on trial, right? Yeah. And sometimes the investigation goes towards them instead of towards the perpetrator. Mm-hmm. And it is recent history. I mean, I know I made myself sound really old, like it was so long ago, but it's the 90s.
Well, that's one thing I would say too, is that although I kind of said earlier on that her testimony is a timestamp in history and that I got to come in the post Anita Hill world, it also goes to show how little progress there has been in the last nearly 30 years, because I think all of us can relate, or at least understand, to anyone in 2020, 2021 not feeling comfortable coming forward to say, my boss has been sexually harassing me. We haven't progressed enough to feel like we wouldn't be blamed, or our character wouldn't be torn apart for coming forward with our truths.
Right. And we're still seeing huge cases blow up in the media now of similar stories. I mean, I'm thinking of like Harvey Weinstein, right? I mean, a power player, and the women involved, also power players in their own right, still intimidated to come forward and not know if it's a safe space they'll walk into on the heels of that. Yeah. No, that's a really good point. So back to 1991, something I found really interesting that you both illuminated on the episode is that she didn't actually step out to make these big claims and accusations, right? Talk about how it unfolded that she even got involved in the story.
Yeah, so I love that you brought that up, because that was something that we wanted to really emphasize in our episode. The fact that she didn't come forward. I think that's the most common misconception about Anita Hill, is that she, saw that Clarence Thomas was about to become the next Supreme Court justice. So she picked up the phone and said, I want to make a public complaint. That's not what happened. She was called by the FBI because they were doing their normal vetting process. This is typical of the process for becoming a Supreme Court nominee. They do a vetting process in which they contact, all your former colleagues, your friends, your family, and she was called. And she had totally expected that. She said in her biography, I 1,000,000% expected to be called because I had worked with him in two different, organizations. But when she was called, she was specifically asked, we understand you were a victim of sexual harassment at the hands of Clarence Thomas. So she didn't initially disclose that information herself. She was specifically asked if that had happened, and she spoke her truth and said, yeah, actually that did.
I just thought of a question. Mm-hmm. Did you read any intel as to where they got that information? Did Clarence lay that out? Like, was a PR person like, tell them everything because they're going to find out? Like, who said it to them?
I love that you asked that, because I'm not sure that anyone really knows, including Anita Hill, because one of her assumptions and I think this is totally valid, was when they said, hey, we believe that, or we've heard you were sexually harassed. Her assumption was that, oh my God, this means this happened to other women too. Other women have come forward. Other women have said that they had these experiences. She later learned that no other women had come forward. They were referring to her and her experiences. And she's really not sure who exactly came forward. She did share with at least 4 friends at the time, back in 1991, just that she was super uncomfortable at work, that she dreaded going to work because her boss talked about the most heinous things in the workplace. But yeah, when I did a bunch of research and even in reading her biography, it didn't appear to be clear exactly who, had leaked this information to the FBI in the first place.
Yeah.
And I mean, as it became clear later on, there were other women that were experiencing this. So maybe one of them came forward, maybe someone who saw or witnessed one of these awful exchanges between the two of them, or one of the other women with Clarence Thomas came forward and was just like, hey, maybe you guys should be aware of this.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I just got very curious about that all of a sudden. So she's asked this question and decides to tell the truth.
Yes.
And she does so thinking it's not going to be public.
Right.
You know, she thinks it's all going to be kept confidential.
Yeah, what a blow, right?
Right.
Like, to summon the courage to say what happened, to tell the truth. And as a lawyer, is she a lawyer at this point? Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
yes.
Yeah, that was actually something I did want to address in her I just said it myself, coming forward. She didn't come forward. She was subpoenaed. You know, I try not to use the term coming forward, but I think what you just said is super important, that she was a law professor at this time. She had worked in the legal field as an attorney before, and she continued in the legal field when she was working under Clarence Thomas. And so I think it was Leah in our episode when we dove into this, that Leah was like, obviously she would come forward. She was subpoenaed by the highest court. Why wouldn't she have come forward? Again, I just used come forward again, but
she very clearly holds the law and our system in high regard, if that's what she's made her career out of.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not surprising to see that she felt she had to tell the truth, and she had to not come forward, but respond when asked about this.
Right. So she's clearly accomplished in her career at this point. But there's some mention of her history and her family and upbringing that I found so interesting. So I wondered if we could bookmark the trial. We'll go back to it, but maybe talk about Anita Hill before we knew her, before we knew of her, and how she got to where she is, because that's equally compelling.
Yeah. Even before all this went down, she was a superwoman. Yeah. So she was actually born in 1965 in Oklahoma, the granddaughter of a slave. I talked about how insane that was to me, that this woman who accomplishes so much later in her life, it was the granddaughter of a slave. She went on to become valedictorian of her high school. She would get highest honors when she completed her bachelor's degree, and then she went on to Yale, where she received her law degree, also with honors. She was working at a Washington, D.C. law firm after completing law school and that's when she was introduced by a mutual friend to Clarence Thomas, who encouraged her to come work for him as his assistant in the newly appointed position as Assistant Secretary of U.S. Department of Education Office of Civil Rights. Whew, that one's a mouthful.
Two-sided business card. So it's beyond impressive. Impressive is when you work hard and are smart. That's overcoming, and that's defying odds, I guess, really.
She's phenomenal. She was the youngest of 13 children, and so she said there was a lot of focus on her, to really grow and do more than her ancestors had. Wow. And she's just phenomenal. She's a phenomenal woman that is so educated, so brilliant, so brave. And I think even just the way she comes across, her demeanor, I have listened to endless interviews from her over the years. I've read her book, and the way that she came across in the testimony was truly so astounding. The testimony, you can watch it on YouTube. It's 5-ish hours, her testimony.
Oh, and that's a long time.
I would watch it 100 times over because she blows my mind.
She's enthralling.
Yes.
She's so composed.
That's a long time to stay composed. That says so much.
I did not watch all 5 hours, but Rachel did.
Multiple times. Because I'm obsessed with her. I think she's just so phenomenal. I'm obsessed with her.
And an overachiever.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's go back then to the trial. So she responds and then is subpoenaed to come into this investigation and following subsequent trial. So politically, what's the climate? And talk about a little bit about Clarence Thomas's role in the appointment. I'm definitely fuzzy on those details.
Sure. Yeah, so I think most people know this about Clarence Thomas just because now he is the longest standing Supreme Court justice that we have. He is typically the farthest right person on the court, and he was nominated by George H.W. Bush to replace Thurgood Marshall, who at that time had served on the court for, I believe it was 24 years. And the climate was very political, which is unfortunate because I know that we now, seeing how political the last year has been with the election and with COVID and everything, I know that now with our hindsight, we think, Anita, how could you not expect this to be political? But she really didn't. She really believed that. I mean, this is one of the highest positions in our country, right? It is a lifetime appointment on the highest court in our country. And so she really believed that these senators that were interviewing and investigating what was going on, that they really truly had the country's best interest in mind, and that they would only put the most qualified person on the highest court. And unfortunately, it ended up being extremely political to where, none of the Republican senators questioned Thomas at all. In fact, they said such horrendous things to Anita Hill, did not believe her, came out long before even the trial happened and said that they did not believe her. And then even the Democratic senators on the panel, even they didn't want to question Thomas because, for one, they didn't want to appear to be in any way prohibiting, a Black American from reaching the highest court, but also they are not particularly great people themselves, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like, for example, one of those people on the panel was Ted Kennedy, who had his own sexual harassment allegations ongoing at the time, I mean, unfortunately, we're seeing that right now, right? With the impeachment trial, is there were people there that day in the Capitol, Republicans, that almost lost their lives, and yet they are so sticking to party lines that they can say this impeachment trial is not constitutional, even though 3 weeks ago they were hiding underneath their desks feeling like they were going to die that day. And we see that here with Anita Hill too.
Yeah, and it's interesting that this sort of transcends the gender conversation around sexual harassment, and there is an element of race at play. Obviously, they're both Black, and you just mentioned they didn't want to put a hurdle in front of an African-American man getting that position, but at the expense of a Black woman who I feel, more often than not are victimized and marginalized and I don't know how to say this any other way, but completely diminished to propel other people forward. So that logic is tough to swallow.
Yeah, she was actually quoted as saying that Clarence Thomas had a race, she had a gender.
It's brutal. It's really, really brutal.
If you want to talk about what's really brutal, we can kind of dive into what those specific claims were that Hill made about Thomas.
Yes. Yeah, let's talk about the actual claims themselves. Trigger warning, I guess, for anybody who's dealt with this. It's gross. It's
really gross.
Yeah.
So yeah, trigger warning.
But important, sure. I think, to name them because she had to endure them and then talk about it for 5 hours in that setting.
Right.
So yeah, what are these allegations and claims?
Yeah. So, again, they're really gross. Anita claimed that only a few months into her professional relationship with Thomas, he began asking her out incessantly. And of course, she would decline every single time, but incessantly he would ask her out. She said he would try to have very uncomfortable and really gross conversations with her in which he would talk about what kind of porn he watched, including women having sex with animals and films showing group sex or rape scenes. He would speak of a particular porn star he liked named Long Dong Silver. He also regularly talked about his own penis and his own sexual preferences. And she also said there was one particular occasion upon which he was sitting at his desk looking at a Coke can, the Coke can incident, which you mentioned, and he asked who put pubic hair on my Coke. Really gross.
Also, just what? Like
why?
Yeah, what?
And it got so bad that she was actually eventually hospitalized in 1983 for work-related stress, which, I feel you on that one. Not to that extent, obviously, but my gosh.
Yeah, I think being asked out incessantly, unwanted attention of the romantic type, that really, to experience that over and over, it really can make you feel unsafe.
Absolutely.
Right? And I think that's what sometimes gets lost. It's like, well, you didn't touch her, you didn't hit her. Yes. It wasn't a physical violation, but the intrusion of someone's desire on you is really offensive.
And it goes back to exactly what you said, Rebecca, at the beginning, or what your teacher said. It doesn't matter what his intention was. If she was uncomfortable because of what he was saying, then he needed to change his actions.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm really glad you brought that up, because that was something that part of why her testimony was torn apart, because Clarence Thomas never grabbed her butt. You know, he never touched her boobs, or, you know what I mean? He never sexually assaulted her. And so the senators ripped her apart for, you know, why are you offended by the things he talked about? It was just him talking, you know, he wasn't doing anything. But I do think, I'm not making excuses at all, because none of this is justified. But I do think we need to put the time capsule on this, that this was 1991. And it wasn't until 1977 that sexual harassment was even an official term. And there was a survey in 1976 that revealed that some 80% of people said they had been sexually harassed in the workplace. Even still, sexual harassment was not a term that people were familiar with in the following years, or were really using or understanding when Hill came forward.
Wow. There's a lot to unpack with the sexual harassment thing, but I'm thinking it is a time capsule of 1991. I keep new examples keep coming to mind. I'm thinking of Chanel Miller, who wrote the book Know My Name.
We read that for a book club we were in.
I love that book. She's brilliant. But some of the commentary around that case was, well, she wasn't raped because she wasn't penetrated vaginally. And again, pardon my explicit, I just have to say it, because that's what people were saying to her, as if what happened to her wasn't a violent assault. So let's talk outcomes and what starts happening.
Sure. We did just talk about, how sexual harassment wasn't really treated as a serious thing, and people weren't really understanding it, whether that's they didn't understand it or they didn't want to understand it. And we see that played out in the types of questions that the senators asked her, because they were literally the worst. And I do think it's important to note that this Senate Judiciary Committee was made up entirely of middle-aged white males that just simply have no understanding of Hill's personal experiences. And we talked about this in our episode too. We never want to make it sound like we're saying that, men can't be sexually harassed, because of course they can, or that men don't experience hostile work environments, because of course they can. But I do think there is something unique to women, that there are some experiences that we have as women that talking to a middle-aged white man about it, he's not going to understand.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. The privilege is just going to block any ability to see that for what it is, especially if it's going to hinder them in some way, their advancement of their own agenda politically, right? So
absolutely. One of the questions she was asked was, why would she have followed Thomas from one job onto the next if he had been sexually harassing her? And I mean, her answer was really simple. For one, she's like, hey, the sexual advances at that point had stopped. And number two, moving on to the EEOC was such a huge opportunity for her. This was at a time when the president was Reagan, and he was kind of threatening to diminish funds to the Department of Education, where both she and Thomas were working. And so Thomas had moved on to the EEOC, and he called her and said, hey, you can stay at the Department of Education if you want, but you might not have a job much longer. And I have a position for you here as my assistant. So she's looking at it like, okay, sexual advances have stopped at this point. It's an awesome opportunity. And I might not have a job much longer if I, stay where I'm currently at. So that's the example that she gave to the senators, and they refused to understand her position on that. Another question that she was asked, which this one is so heinous to me, one of the senators said he didn't understand exactly why Hill could be so upset about the fact that Thomas discussed things such as, this is a quote, large breasts in the workplace. Because, here's another quote, "This is not too bad. Women's large breast. That is a word we use all the time." I don't know what workplace people are referring to women's large breasts in and how in any way that could ever be okay.
I mean, that just reeks of kind of old school, anything goes Mad Men vibes, right? Where they did rule the office and they were like drinking and smoking and talking how they wanted and probably slapping women's ass.
That's exactly what I said. I said it's like locker room or, cigar lounge talk or whatever after, that's not what should be happening in the workplace.
Right. Right. And again, it's a place of privilege to say, why? What's the big deal? We
Right.
always do this.
Right.
What a response.
And what's really interesting, too, is some women even criticized Anita Hill at the time because it was especially like kind of older school feminists or people that fought for their right to vote or fought for women's rights in maybe the 60s or 70s because they were like, we fought to be here and you're just complaining now. Like, this is just something. Suck it up. This is what it is, which is so unfair.
So unfair and also so sad and indicative of the patriarchy. Sorry, I don't usually get this riled up about this, but to me that when a woman has to say that to another woman because it's going to jeopardize the whole lot of us, it's so sad to me. It's like we can only go so far and don't ruin this for all of us.
I think
that's heartbreaking.
I'm a hardcore feminist. I make no secret of that at all. I wear, I don't know if you can see it. It's a necklace that has the female sign. I wear this every single day. But I would say kind of what you just said, Rebecca, is like no other episode had I ever gotten this riled up before this one that we covered, just because I think it's so relatable and because I think we still see these themes 30 years later. And that's really disheartening.
Yep.
What's even grosser, too, is some of the senators would ask her if she was like a scorned woman, as if that's the only reason she should come forward, or like asked her if she had a martyr complex. Like, it was really despicable the way that they treated her. And what's even grosser is they were insinuating she was doing this for some sort of benefit to her own career or something. But in fact, it was the exact opposite. She did not like the attention. She didn't want to be there. And she was subpoenaed to be there. She had to be there.
Despicable is a good word. Yeah. So where's Clarence Thomas? What does he say or not say?
He provided his response the following day in which he denied all of the allegations. I have a quote here from exactly what he said in response to her testimony. He said, "This is a circus. It's a national disgrace. And from my standpoint as a Black American, as far as I'm concerned, it is a high-tech lynching for uppity Blacks who in any way deign to think for themselves, to do for themselves, to have different ideas. And it's a message that unless you kowtow to an old order, this is what will happen to you. You will be lynched, destroyed, caricatured by a committee of the U.S. Senate rather than hung from a tree."
Oh my gosh.
What's so strange hearing that again, because she read that quote in our episode too, is that statement is more true of what was happening to Anita than it is to what was happening to him.
That's a great point.
They were assassinating her character, and I mean, like, there was even claims that she was an erotomaniac, or I believe that's the term, where she was delusional into thinking that Clarence was in love with her.
Yeah. Okay.
So her character was much more being lynched or destroyed, if you will, than his.
Yeah, that's hard for me to even respond to for a number of reasons. As a white woman, just in general, it feels audacious to me, and absolutely like he's taking zero responsibility. And it's a major deflection. And I feel like it's exploitive, really.
I think it's a really hard thing to respond to because, like you just said, as all three of us are white women, and we have not had the lived experiences of Black men or women in America. And because we know of the history of incarceration and over-policing and slavery in this country, it is an uncomfortable and tough topic. And that is the position that the senators were in. It was uncomfortable. None of these, the all-white committee wanted to be seen as trying to keep an African American from reaching a position in the highest court. And so they just didn't challenge him. They didn't question him. They heard his response and confirmed him.
And that's the outcome. That's
yeah.
Oh.
Even worse, they didn't call forward. There were 3 other women that were ready to testify about their own similar experiences, almost identical to Hill's. One of them was working as his subordinate, and then was having sexual comments made about her. Another one was said she was caught in uncomfortable conversations with him, and then another one, same as Anita, said that she was incessantly being asked out by him. But again, none of the senators called any of them to testify. They were just let go without saying anything, being able to speak their truth and support Anita's claims. And then, despite all of this, as you just insinuated, Thomas was confirmed as a U.S. Supreme Court Justice on October 15th, 1991. And what's even more shocking and kind of cringy is it was a 52-48 vote, which is one of the closest confirmations in history.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, we see that 52-48 vote again with this last year, Amy Coney Barrett. Same numbers.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting. A question on the process, the legal process. Does Anita Hill and the other women who would have spoken, do they not get representation? I know it's not a trial in the traditional criminal sense. So how do you make sure you're kind of protected in that process? Like, why did they just get to decide they're not bringing them forward?
That is such a great question. To speak to Anita Hill's representation, so in reading her biography, she was so, at the moment, just overwhelmed with everything going on because all this was very quick for her. She wasn't even called by the FBI until they'd already started the confirmation hearing for Thomas. In fact, by the time she was subpoenaed, they had already finished the confirmation hearing and they were currently debating whether they were going to confirm him or not. So they had to reopen the confirmation hearing, which this is only the 3rd time in history that that's ever happened. It's very unusual. So all of this is moving at lightning speed for her. And so she gets a call. So she works in the legal field. She has a lot of friends in the legal industry. And she gets a call from one of her colleagues that's like, hey, you do have legal representation, right? And she's like, do I need that? They're like, yeah, girlfriend, you need that. And so it's her legal team was only put together in the hours. Probably, I mean, when I say hours, I mean like 48 hours ish prior to her testimony.
Oh, yeah. Not a lot of time.
No, and
okay.
Yeah. And to speak to, why these other people weren't called to testify, truly, the Senate Judiciary Committee could do whatever they wanted. In fact, they knew about Hill for a while and these, potential sexual harassment allegations, and were not planning to call her forward. The only reason they subpoenaed her is because NPR actually leaked the FBI interview. And then obviously they would look really shitty if they didn't then call her forward.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. It's so much more than I remember. I was just old enough to remember it happening, but obviously I wasn't paying close attention. And I've only recently revisited the details. Yeah. There's so much there. Mm-hmm. We've sort of touched on it throughout the conversation, but in both of your opinions, I'd love to hear if this story were to play out this year in 2021, what do you think would be different, or how much would it look the same?
I think, unfortunately, as Rachel said earlier, not a lot has changed. Things kind of look similar. And a perfect example of that is, we mentioned in our episode kind of the similarities between what happened at Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation hearing in 2018. So not that long ago, just a couple years ago, when Christine Blasey Ford, who was a psychology professor, testified at Kavanaugh's hearing alleging that he had sexually assaulted her in 1982. And guess what happened? The same exact thing. Right. She was character assassinated, and he ended up just moving forward. Nothing came of it.
Yeah.
The one difference that I did see between those two, the testimony of Anita Hill in 91 and the testimony of Christine Blasey Ford in 2018, because I did rewatch the 2018 testimony in preparation for our Anita Hill episode. And I would say that there are a few differences that were encouraging to see, in that nearly every senator thanked her for coming forward, for testifying, and nearly all of them apologized to her for what she and her family had been through since going public. And some of the senators, including Kamala Harris, said, "I believe you." And just hearing those words, like, that actually gives me goosebumps right now, just saying that. Just to be there and to hear someone say, "I believe you, and I'm sorry that this happened to you," is so powerful. And this in no way occurred during Anita Hill's testimony. She didn't receive the same empathy or support that Ford did. But like Leah said, similar to Hill, Ford's statements and character were torn apart. Trump famously tweeted out about the incident that she was obviously lying, because if she was telling the truth, she would have reported the incident back when it initially occurred. She received death threats, and similar to Anita Hill, she actually ended up having to leave her job at the university that she taught at.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really sobering to think about the parallels there and the years between them. But you're right, there is a newer spirit of believing women that I think exists, but it's more of a movement, and it's not always powerful enough to change outcome or even the process. So that's hard. But do you both feel that we're like moving in the right direction?
I mean, the fact that Kamala Harris, a woman of color, was even on that review committee, that
that
confirmation hearing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that tells you that some things have improved, right?
Yeah.
Instead of a panel of all white middle-aged men. So I do think that there is movement. It's obviously just not as quickly as we would hope.
Yeah. So where are they now? Well, we know a bit about Clarence Thomas, I suppose. He's been more, I guess, in the news than Anita Hill. What is she doing, Ms. Hill, these days?
So she had every intention, following the testimony, to just return to a normal life, which I know we can all look at that and kind of laugh at, that she thought that would even be a possibility for her. It really stinks that she unfortunately had the mindset of, like, this was the worst day of my life, but tomorrow I'm going to return to normal. She went back to teaching law in Oklahoma, but she ended up having to resign after 5 years because the political pressure was so bad. She was tenured at that university. In fact, she was the first African American to be tenured at that university, but Republicans worked so hard to get her fired that she ended up resigning after 5 years.
Oh.
Yeah. So she works in civil rights and employment law. She specializes in social policy, women's studies, gender and sexuality studies. She regularly speaks at events and television programs, and she's also published 2 autobiographies. And then, we kind of already touched on already, Clarence Thomas, he's now 72 years old. He's the longest serving member of the court. And although he does avoid the spotlight, he does continue to be a pretty controversial figure to this day, because he is the most right-winged member of the court and has often ruled in such extremely conservative ways that even other conservative members of the court have declined to join him.
Wow.
Yeah.
So 2 books she's written.
Yes.
I gotta get my hands on one of these.
Yes. Her first one, it's called Speaking Truth to Power, and it is so good. And it's all about her experience going through the testimony. And her second book, it's called, what is it called? Reimagining Equality, Stories of Gender, Race, and Finding Home. And that one's a bit more recent.
Nice.
Yeah.
I was really delighted to hear your book story of receiving the book that you got. Can you tell us about that? That was amazing.
I would love to, because this is like my pride and joy these days. So I would say it's the little things in 2020, 2021 that get us
Absolutely.
excited, but this would have been phenomenal in any place, time.
Agreed.
So for our episodes, we do so much research because it is the most important thing to me with our history podcast is to have accurate information. And anytime, even if I'm even remotely not certain that the information I'm providing is accurate, I always tell our audience, like, one source says this, another source says this, it's unclear, so research is my number one priority. And so to put together our Anita Hill episode, there was no way I could do that without purchasing her autobiography and reading from, her own words, her experience. And so I bought the book off of Thrift Books. For anyone that's not familiar with Thrift Books, it's like a what is it? Like, it's just a discount online.
Yeah, it's like a used bookstore online. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's brilliant. Yeah.
It's fantastic. That's where, like, Leah and I shared, we're in a book club and we get almost all our books from Thrift Books or Abe Books. So I purchased this book off of Thrift Books for $3. It shows up and I open the book and out falls on the ground this little orange ticket. And it was a ticket from 1997, a speaking engagement that Anita Hill did in which she read excerpts from her book. So I'm already thinking, like, this is so freaking cool. And then I open the book up and on the title page is Anita Hill's signature.
Oh my God. Like, even hearing it the second time, I'm like emotional. I'm like a big signs person and things are meant to be, and I don't know, that book found you when it did, like, blows my mind. It's so beautiful. And also, talk about a time capsule. You literally got one, like, from the 90s.
I know. So and how
crazy.
Cool too. I just think, like, exactly what you said. The odds at it, like, this is the copy I got because there were several other used copies available, and the fact that Thrift Books, I don't know, didn't check and they just, like, left the ticket in there, that they didn't charge me more because they didn't check to see that it was a signed copy. I don't know, just all the things aligning. I definitely shed a few tears over it. It was very cool.
Meant to be yours.
Yeah.
For sure. Where do you think her lasting impact has been and will be?
I think looking at Rachel and seeing how inspired her whole life has been by Anita Hill, but not just Rachel, other women too. I'm going to be honest in saying I'd heard of this prior to us doing our episode on it, but I was not as informed as Rachel was. But I would say a lot of women are, and I think that a lot of women are inspired or have been inspired by her. And one example of this is after this court case, like Rachel said at the beginning, sexual harassment cases, people coming forward increased threefold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So she definitely left an impact. I think she inspired a lot of people to speak up, and even though she did not come forward, as we said 100 times, I think she has inspired a lot of people to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, including Christine Blasey Ford, who said, I was inspired by Anita Hill to speak my truth.
Yeah.
That's huge.
That's huge. I love it. Well, totally switching gears. Something I ask all my guests before they go is, what is keeping you up at night? And the answer can be literal or figurative or both. So I'd love to hear from both of you.
I'll do literal first, but then I might also do a figurative
Please,
one.
That's how it usually ends up.
My cat. As you heard him meowing.
I can see why.
Yeah, he's a little noisy right now and a little needy.
Mm-hmm. It happens.
I would say everything keeps me up because I'm a chronic insomniac.
Oh,
but
that's brutal.
Yeah. But it actually was something that I believe it was on your show, Rebecca, and I believe it was Kirk Nurmi who shared it, that I was so inspired by his answer to this question that I would like it to be my answer, and I'm working towards it being my answer. He had shared that after his battle with cancer, I think you asked him, so what keeps you up at night? And he's like, nothing. Nothing keeps me up at night because nothing matters, compared to facing like a death sentence that he faced for a period of time, thinking he was going to die. Nothing matters enough to keep you up at night. And while that's not my answer, I'm working towards that being my answer.
I love that answer. And I think Kirk will too. He was such a gem and a surprise of a man. Was delighted by him. But yeah, what a beautiful answer. It's a good goal. Now, how about you, Leah? Do you have a figurative keeping you up at night?
Not necessarily true crime related, but I think
That's
just
okay.
COVID generally. And I don't know if it was on the actual episode, but I'm an event planner. That's my trade, my day job. And just seeing that events are still happening right now. Obviously not any events I'm putting on, but events in general, large events, like for instance, the Super Bowl that just happened a little bit ago, is terrifying to me and very concerning. So that keeps me up at night. I'm a little worried about that.
Yeah, that's been a common answer over here on the show. And yeah, same. And I appreciate you saying that as an event planner, because you could also be up at night because your work has probably decreased. And I'm sure that's scary in its own right. But to still even see the bigger picture and kind of look beyond that is, appreciate that.
Yeah, I can 100% see that the greater good is much more important than throwing a party.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sorry, but regardless, that's my job. That's what keeps me employed, but I can acknowledge that for sure.
I love that. That's going on a t-shirt. The greater good is, what did you say, bigger than throwing a party or better than throwing a party? Yeah. I love that. That'd be nice if everybody could operate by that rule. Thank you both for coming. You're both just talented and smart women. Love your show, and I'm so grateful that you came on the podcast today.
Thank you so much.
We're so happy to be here.
Yay. Thank you both. Dialogue is a Yellowtape Media production, edited by Jason Usry and produced and hosted by me, Rebecca Sebastian. Please be sure to subscribe to Dialogue, a true crime conversation, wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on social media. We are at Dialogue Pod across all platforms. You can also drop me a note or a guest suggestion or sign up for my newsletter at RebeccaSebastian.com. Be sure to join me every Wednesday for a new episode and another killer conversation.